All right. Welcome everybody to this month's edition of Africa Liberty webinar. My name still is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am the editor here at African Liberty. So it's a special occasion for this edition of the webinar because, as you know, normally we discuss what people call topical issues of the continent that are affecting, prosperity and freedom on the continent. But this month we are taking a special break to celebrate the publication of the African Liberty magazine called The Freedom African. For many of you who are a long-time fan or follower of African Liberty, you realize that, or you may recall that back in, should I say, the early 2010s, we used to publish should I say edited volume called the Recording in Progress. Yeah, I think the edited volume was called Voices from Africa. And it was a very widely circulated publication across the continent then. But it's kind of paused, and ever since we haven't really taken time to invest in our print publication. But this will be our first print publication since Voices from Africa. So it's been like about how many, maybe 7 or 8 year break. But you may mute one of the
sure.
devices. All right. So yeah, this is a collection of contributions from fantastic freedom fighters from across the continent, particularly those who invest in fighting for freedom through the pen or with the pen. We're talking about journalists and commentators, and should I say academic as well, and also poets or literary people, those who are interested in poetry and whatnot, or even artwork. So we are so happy and privileged to have fantastic people like Hanan Razek, who is the BBC Arabic correspondent, I think. Okay, so we do have very fantastic people from across the continent. As I was saying, we have Hanan Razek, who is the BBC Africa one of the main correspondents. And I think she's from Egypt. We have a very lengthy interview with her published in the magazine. Of course, we have David Undeyi, and equally a lengthy interview from him as well. And of course, many of you already know David Undeyi, the founder of West Africa Weekly, and a very major voice in the journalism space, not only in Nigeria, but of course in the English-speaking world in Africa. And we have contributions from the CEO, for example, of Free Market Foundation in South Africa, David Ansara. We have contributions from Lenora Ebule, the founder of Bail & Spice. For many people who are based in the US, she is a Cameroonian, a think tanker or an intellectual entrepreneur, but she's also very much a business owner, and she owns Bail & Spice. And I mean, several others, including myself and Dr. Adeyemi and Chiamaka. So today we're trying to, of course, the magazine itself launches officially on the 8th of March, which is about 2 weeks from now. So it's going to be available online for people who want to have the e-copy. And my colleague, Andrew, will be sure to post a link to the page where you'll download the e-copy. The link is simply africanliberty.org/TFA. And although it's not available on it now, it will be uploaded on the 8th of March. So the upload will be available on the 8th of March, but you can always subscribe to the newsletter to get it first and to be one of the people that get it first when it's available. But there will be an official launch program or event in Nairobi in Kenya on the 8th, between the 8th and 9th of March. It's a 2-day event, but officially it's going to be launched on the 9th of March in Nairobi, Kenya. And I think some of us are going to be there in person. But for many of us who are not going to be able to make it to Nairobi, which is, I mean, that's the reason why we're having this virtual lunch. So having said that, I think I should also use the moment to remind us that the call for application for our annual fellowship, the writing fellowship, will be out in the first week of March as well, as usual. And I think the last time we received about 2,200 applications from about 45 countries in Africa. So this time around, I'm sure the numbers will be close to that, if not more. And for those who are interested in joining our writing fellowship program, that's a very useful information. Again, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you get all those information when they come out. All right, I haven't said all this. Let's go to the business of the day. So we have 3 of our contributors who have been so generous and kind to join us today. First among them is Feyisade Adeyemi, or should I say newly minted Dr. Feyisade Adeyemi. Is a trans-disciplinary educator, development practitioner, and public speaker. He teaches culture and tourism in Africa, citizenship education, among other courses at Elizade University, Ilara-Mokin. In addition to academic articles published in local and international journals, he has authored several opinion articles published in The Sun, The Guardian, The Nation newspaper, Tell magazine, among many others. Welcome, Dr. Adeyemi. Your microphone is muted, but I'm sure you don't need it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ibrahim. Just to make a little correction, I no longer work at Elizade University.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for letting us know. But you are the founder of Charlie Institute.
Absolutely.
Still the founder. Thank you. Then we have Chiamaka Adinnu. Our very own Chiamaka Adinnu was recently a master's student of food security and quality engineering at the Szent Istvan University in Hungary. She currently works with African Liberty as an editorial assistant and an established writer. She is, she writes on international trade and global economic trends, including food and agriculture. She has worked with reputable local and international media outlets and has public works in these areas. Welcome, Chiamaka.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim.
Yes, ma'am. And we have David Ondeni, who is a writer and journalist who specializes in business, politics, and security. His work has featured in various prominent publications, such as Al Jazeera, the Africa Report, Channels TV, Business Day, West Africa Weekly, and CNN Africa. Ondeni's contributions were highlighted in the New Yorker magazine and the Netflix documentary, Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy, specifically in episode 4 of that documentary. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. All right. So as usual, you have the comment section or the comment box to engage. And for people who want to come up onto the panel, you can just raise your hand and make sure you have your question ready. Then we'll be able to bring you to the panel. But if you're not comfortable to join the panel, you can just raise your hand and ask your question in the chat box. So I guess the best way to start is to say thank you for taking the time to contribute to this magazine. But I want to know what each of you imagine to be the role of young people in Africa today when it comes to the advocacy for freedom. I mean, you have different expertise: journalists, an agriculture expert, food insecurity expert, then an academic. And I believe you have divergent views of what the role of young people should be in freedom advocacy on the continent today. So that's a good way to start. And I would like to hear what you have to say in that regard. So maybe we should start first with Chiamaka. The microphone is muted, Chiamaka.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I believe that the youths have a huge role to play in advocacy. First of all, we are the voice of change, and we have every facility at our tools at our disposal. We have digital tools right now, like you just mentioned, I'm a journalist. So I believe that youths can use very different medium or media to actually promote advocacy and to promote the freedom of Africa. I also believe that the youths are the future of tomorrow, like we always say. So they are in a better position to actually talk about what tomorrow should be. There should be the leading voice of change. And this is really what I believe that the youth can do in terms of advocacy. Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's not even news that the history of freedom on the continent, particularly from the 1880s, have always been driven through the media, through print media, first of all, in Abeokuta, Lagos. And of course, that we started transitioning to the creation of media across West Africa and early more in South Africa. Then, of course, the new media, social media, as we call it today. So it's not surprising to see that that's a recommendation, because the media has been a channel for the youth when it comes to advocacy for anti-colonial resistance, anti-military occupation and whatnot. But I think that's a good segue to David, who is a very much more established journalist. And David, I'm suspecting your answer will also be through the media. But do you think of any other way, drawing from your experience, that you think are more rewarding ways for young people like ourselves to demand truth to power and more freedom for the continent?
So I think it all depends on what space you happen to find yourself in. I happen to find myself in the media space, and I decided to make that the focus of the message or the ideology that I was trying to pass across. I think in whatever space you find yourself in, there are ways to sort of be the change that one wants to see in the world. Obviously, some spaces like the media space, just by virtue of what they are, happen to have more influence or happen to be louder than others, but it doesn't mean that it's restricted to just the media. If you, I don't know, work in a bank or in a fertilizer company or something, you work in a restaurant, there are still ways through which you can still at least have an impact on the world around you. Not everyone is destined to be a journalist. Not everyone is going to be a politician or someone with a big platform. But even with the relatively smaller platforms that we all have, there are still ways, even just by using even social media, which is a very democratized form of media that everyone has access to nowadays. You don't need to be a journalist to have a social media account. But with a social media account, you can have infinitely more reach than any journalist ever accomplished. If you have the right amount of content upstairs. So the media is definitely a very important tool, but I think even over and away from the media, whatever space one finds oneself in, it is possible to create the circumstances for some sort of change to happen.
That's correct. That really is very spot on. And I wonder if that resonates with you, Feyisade. You and I are in academia, and we know things can be quite challenging for young people in the academia. If it's Nigeria or South Africa, or even if it's outside, for you to own your voice and feel as though you can write freely and speak freely as you will or you would in other spaces like David does in the media. But Feyisade, as an academic, does that change, or is this the same thing, the media as well?
Yeah, yes, it's essentially no, not just the media. I mean, even David already mentioned. Hello, yeah, David already mentioned that you do it, wherever you find yourself, which is absolutely correct. So it's not just in the media. Even though we all have access to use the media, like I do write articles that get published from time to time, even if it's not my primary area. So, but like he said, I think we need to approach these things as culturally, because it's essentially a cultural problem, and so the solutions is also has to come, culturally as well. People need to start having these conversations even at the level of the family. for me, I've come to a point where I've come to recognize that many of the problems that we have, if not all, in fact, all of the problems really are essentially a cultural problem. They have long history behind them prior to now. And some of them are some of the things that we supposedly are proud of as elements of our traditional cultures, which in modern times have come into conflict in terms of how to carry them forward into a modern world. So like in academia, like you said, I wouldn't know how it is in the West, and you are out there, but my academic experience has been essentially in Nigeria. And you just find that people want to bring in all the traditional, values that has run back to thousands of years. People almost want you to prostrate for them, because they are your senior colleagues or something. I actually had an incident where somebody who is actually my junior colleague, claimed that I'm supposed to pander to him, report to him, and so on the grounds that he's older than me in age. So I faced a whole lot of age discrimination kind of issues, even though I want to believe that I put in my best, and I was flying quite high during the time that I was in the academics. But you cannot but notice these problems where young people are being suppressed, and it's done culturally. It's people tell you that he's older than you, and that's just it. That's supposed to cover everything. Somebody can go get away with anything just on the grounds of age difference. So like David said, the pushback has to happen culturally and across board. So it's not just a media thing. People in academics have to sit up and say, come on. If I'm qualified, if I've written the papers, if I've gotten all the merit as far as the requirements are concerned, then why would you try to slow me down on grounds of age, which is quite prominent in Nigerian academia? Anyone who has experienced academia in Nigeria will tell you that. But go away from academia, go to any other sector in Nigeria, I can tell you, you'll find very similar issues, except maybe in some of the new, like in tech, for example, of course, it's more liberal and so on. So, but what is going on in tech can also happen elsewhere if people begin to have these conversations as we are having now, and also begin to discuss them as a cultural phenomenon, so that we begin to improve the cultural experiences that we produce in this part.
Yeah, I do not disagree with you, because again, you look at the history of the continent itself, starting from the 1900s, we most of the moment-changing commentaries or publications or advocacy have often come from people in the academia a lot. These were young people who were writing then, from South Africa to Uganda to Nigeria. But today, it seems as though the only thing you hear from our academic institutions, maybe except from South Africa, are the voices of our older people. So there seems to be a disconnect there. But as you rightly said, it's only necessary that we address what is considered to be cultural today, because many of those cultural traditions are actually invented. But anyway, that's a debate for another time. So now we're going to go into the contribution from each of you. While I try to do that, may I ask Andrew to kindly post the title of each for the respective contributions from David, Chiamaka, and Feyi in the comment box, so that our audience can have an idea of what these contributions are. And also, if you have questions, please paste them in the Q&A or raise your hand if you want to join the panel. So, Chiamaka, I recall your contribution is about agriculture and primarily food insecurity on the continent. And this was written, I think you submitted the op-ed, when was that? I think it's October or November. But fast forward today, in many places in West Africa, more so, there seems to be food crisis. So may I ask, what was that contribution about? And how do you see that article being not only timely, but also, should I say, not only timely for now, but also useful for understanding the food insecurity problem on the continent for the time being?
Thank you very much for your question. I actually wrote on technology, using technology to rescue Africa from food insecurity. And as you know, agriculture is Africa's biggest employer of labor. Like, it employs 70% of the labor force. And it really has an impact on over 900 and something million inhabitants. So this is really a huge sector in Africa. But despite all this, we face significant food security challenges. And this was the inspiration behind my contribution. I felt that even till now, Africa should not be facing the food insecurity that it is facing. We have so much resources at our disposal, and we should be using these resources. So my contribution was about using technology, and I believe it's still timely even in the present Africa, because in the developed countries, we see that they use precision agriculture and they use other smart tools, digital tools, data to plan their resources, and also to plan their resources, data-driven solutions. And these solutions, they are able to revolutionize the food problems that they have. So I feel that Africa can employ these kind of solutions to address the food insecurity challenges that we have. And me writing on this topic, I was really motivated because I believe that by writing on such a timely topic, we can actually start the discussion that we need to have. Africa can do better in terms of addressing the food insecurity challenges. And I believe that by writing on this topic, we'll be able to start discussing the issues that we have and actually be able to address these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is, I think it's all going to be timely. Actually, we do have two pieces on agriculture and technology, or food and technology on, in the magazine itself. So one is from you. So I really don't want to localize the example I want you to give, because there seems to be one country, West Africa, also that's just having some really bad series of food crisis at this point, the last 1 month. But I don't want to localize it to one country. We're going to come back to that later. To David, we had an interview with you, and I'm looking at the comments itself. Maybe I can actually share aspects of it for the moment. Should be towards the end. So while I'm trying to get that up, David, can you recall some of the major propositions you had in that interview you gave, or you want to summarize for our audience? Because this is my own favorite quote from what you were saying, but I'm very sure you have your own favorite picks from me too. But generally, what do you think you were trying to say in that interview?
So, one of the key messages I was keen to pass across is that when we have conversations talking about freedom in the civil society, NGO world, people often equate that to civil rights. So basically, we're talking about freedom. We're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of association. Yes, those are very important parts of freedom. But I feel like another key freedom, which isn't discussed nearly as much, and which is probably the single most important freedom, is economic freedom. Because if someone has the right to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of whatever, and the person doesn't have freedom of, the right to make a living, freedom of putting food in your stomach, then every other freedom that you have is completely pointless. And I feel like in the African world, that is a freedom that is highly, highly restricted. So I've had the opportunity to engage with a number of organizations in the civil society space. I'm obviously going to focus a lot on civil society because no one else does any kind of advocacy on behalf of freedom as a concept. So unfortunately, I'm going to focus a lot on civil society. And every time the conversation is had, it always ends up skewing towards something along the lines of, oh, this person was arrested, should be freed, legal action, where so and so should issue a statement, we're reaching out to the international community, people should make noise. And yes, those things are very important. Right? But there was a conversation I had with a Senegalese lady. Her name is Magat Wade. She's a very good friend of mine. Senegalese American. She's a very well-known entrepreneur. And something she said, this was about 2 years ago, never left my mind. She said it's impossible to subjugate an economically freed people. It's impossible to subjugate a prosperous people. So, and I think that's like the missing, like if you like, the missing key or the missing piece of the puzzle. And I think that's a large part of the reason why we've been having these same conversations since I was a child, really, because the kind of conversations that we have in the CSO space, they're the same conversations that were happening in 1989 before I was born. And they're still happening now. We're still talking about people getting arrested because they wrote something that some government person they didn't like. The conversation hasn't really moved forward yet. And yet, in that time, if supposedly there has been a transition to democracy, supposedly freedoms have been written into constitutions. And this is not just in Nigeria, by the way, this is across Africa. Because generally speaking, there was a transition from military dictatorships to democratically elected governments around the turn of the century for much of Africa. And yet, we're still having those conversations. Supposedly, these governments are elected. Supposedly, they're democratic, they're civilian, and yet we're still having these conversations. So what is it that is missing? And it is my argument that what is missing is economic freedom. Now, what does economic freedom mean? It means that if, for example, today, as you are, you come across you come across a certain technology that could do something dramatic if it were applied back home. So say in Cameroon, for example, sorry, there's an echo. So say in Cameroon, for example, where the rate of harvest losses that farmers suffer is one of the highest in the African continent. Say you were to come across some certain technology, maybe from South Korea or somewhere, Cambodia, wherever, and that technology could reduce harvest spoilage by maybe 60 or 50%. That sort of thing, if it were to be put into action back home, would reduce the price of food, would improve the country's food security, would have a dramatic effect. And yet, what you discover, almost without variation across the entire African continent, maybe with the exception of South Africa, is that if you were to try to bring that technology back home, the first thing that will happen is that your government would stop you. That's the first thing that will happen reflexively. Whether they understand what it is or not, the first thing they do is stop you before anything else. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's technology, whether it's art, whether it's ideas, whatever it is that could potentially create some sort of growth, that could spark some sort of change. The first response by the government is restrict, ban, overregulate. It's always stop you. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world where governments adopt a very different position toward ideas, toward innovation, toward human evolution, that is where prosperity happens. It's not by accident. So there was a time in our own lifetime, we have seen Dubai go from a very minor city in the world where it was basically just a little stopover city on the way to places that actually matter. That's all it was. There was nothing incredible about Dubai. As recently as maybe 1995, there was literally nothing there.
Right.
And in the space of 20-something years, we have seen it go from insignificance to becoming a global center. And it didn't do this by many people have this idea that, oh, it's because of oil. Yes, oil revenues from Abu Dhabi played a large part in this. We know that. But what is also true is that oil now constitutes less than 1% of Dubai's GDP. Everybody wants to go to Dubai. Why is that? Simple reason is the government, even though it's not a democracy, and they lack all these freedoms that we always talk about, because you don't have freedom of movement, You don't have freedom of association in Dubai. You can't even make a WhatsApp video call in Dubai. If you tweet the wrong thing in Dubai, they will put you in prison. It's not a free society. And yet everyone wants to go there, including people who come from countries in Africa where we have these freedoms on paper. Why is that? It's because the most important freedom of all, which is economic, they decided to be deliberate, to be intentional about creating the conditions for economics to carry it to perform the magic that it does, and without them interfering too much. It's as simple as that. That's why.
Right. Sorry, you're absolutely right, David. And that comment from Magat, I think many of us know Magat. We're a personal friend, we are. And you know what's actually interesting to me is the fact that a journalist like you will be so interested in economic freedom rather than the usual thing one will expect from a journalist, human rights. Human rights, against oppression and tyranny. But I'm going to come back to that because there is an aspect of your interview in the second part, a particular question regarding harassment and persecution that I would like for you to touch on, and there's also a question for you in the chat box. So once I'm done with Dr. Adeyemi, then I'm going to circle back to you. So Dr. Adeyemi, your piece, this is it. It's about coup on the continent. And how timely is that? So, that's one of the most timely pieces we have in the magazine. Because not only have we seen in the last few months an increase in the number of successful coups across the continent, but many of these coups have some lining to them, which is like, there seems to be a departure from the Western American, should I say, interests or emphasis in seeing America or the West generally as savior. And in fact, in many cases where we've seen coups on the continent, Gabon, Niger, elsewhere in Mali, people there often have gravitated towards Russia and in fact departing from France. So I know you say a lot in this piece, but what are you trying to say generally in this piece, and how does it help us understand coups which have happened and those that are yet to happen, unfortunately?
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. So I'm coming from a place where I'm in academics, and I've listened to just too many scholars who, in their analysis of the problems of Africa, sub-Saharan African countries, they blame colonialism, which I believe everyone here must be very familiar with. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to absolve colonialism of blame, but you see, when there's one-sidedness,
I think it's my network the problem.
prior, can you hear me?
Hey, I can hear you. I think there was a network problem.
Oh, okay, that's what I'm trying to use to.
Go ahead. We can hear you clearly now. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. So looking at what happened before Africa prior to colonialism and after colonialism becomes very important. For instance, prior to colonialism, we had something like trans-Saharan slave trade, which nobody really talks about.
Oh, the network is not having favor on us.
Democracies. And shortly after, we had all these military coups. And it was very obvious. Things went quickly downhill, especially as the military coups began. In fact, some of the military coups led to civil wars. Like in Nigeria, the military coup quickly led to a civil war that led to the death of 3 million people, essentially a genocide. It wasn't even that bad during colonial rule. We didn't have 3 million people dying within 3 years during colonial rule or even slave trade, So we need to begin to look at some of the things that we are doing to ourselves. And so that's where my interest in military regime or kind of experience is coming. Of course, I have had my personal experience, even as a child, growing up in under military rule in Nigeria and all of that. So in 2020, I was on a TV interview with Halftime Television, and that was when there was the first coup, I think. And they were asking me, why was everybody running to Mali then, the African leader? And I said, look, these guys know that COVID is not the only thing that could go viral. Military coups could also go viral. And 3 years later, we've had 7 countries gone to military coup. And so everybody's wondering what's going on. Why are we having all of this, So my article was trying to analyze the issues and, trying to understand why African countries are, circling back to military coups. And it just boils down to the failure, unfortunately, the failure of democracy. I noticed David was using in quotes when he was talking about, he was doing quotation marks with his fingers when he was mentioning, every time he mentioned democracy with regards to African countries. That's exactly what I would do. Because when you look at the democracy index, you find that these countries that we call democratic have not actually been democratic. They've been very autocratic, and that is where the problem comes from. In fact, one of the things I wrote in the piece is that typically the so-called democratic leaders are the ones who invite the military into governance to start with. You're talking about, for instance, rigging of elections. Almost every time they involve, first of all, they're not even supposed to involve the military in conduct of elections, but they not just involve them in the conduct of elections, they actually use them to rig elections.
Right.
Okay. And just to mention that instance of many various, multiple instances of abuse of powers that goes on in the so-called democracies. So ultimately, you have dysfunctional democracies, democracies that are not really democratic, and also democracies that were essentially designed by the military. And I think that is where a lot of the issues also come from. The fact that just the same way we talk about how the colonial masters set us up to fail when they left, we should now begin to also look at how the military sets a supposed democracy up to fail. We're talking of military that left but never left because they gave you an over-centralized system, which you are bound to use in your so-called democracy. And you have situations where many times the military, former military rulers are still in power in democratic situations, So I'm not too optimistic.
Okay, the network seems to be cutting off from Feyisade's end.
Because of the failure of democracy.
Feyisade, your network is giving us some interesting thoughts. But yeah, yeah, I think we can come to that.
Is it better now?
Yeah, but it's kind of shaky. So don't worry, we're going to come back to the aspect of your conclusion. But I think you covered a lot of ground in what you already said. And I will really implore. In fact, we have two pieces on coup in the magazine itself, and one is from you. The other is from one of our colleagues, I think from Ethiopia or Somalia. But this is an interesting piece that I really want everybody to take time to see if they have the time. So we're gonna go to we do have questions that we should answer, but Chiamaka, briefly, your piece, I'm trying to see what page it is, but your piece here is actually quickly followed by the other piece on agroecology by our other colleague, Bukola Adinnu. But I guess the problem I often have with agricultural people is that, and I'm sure I'm very wrong, is that many of you guys seems to often not communicate with people in the civil society or people in, say, the media. I mean, younger people like yourself are doing it now, but many of our professors, they just focus on the agricultural theories and, working physically on the farm with all these techniques and whatnot. And there seems to be a disconnect between what is actually happening with agricultural experts or expertise and public opinion. Like, people do not know enough about all these new technologies or new innovations. But if there is one thing you want people to take away from your piece, and from the piece from Bukola Adinnu, because you also edited that piece, what would it be?
Okay, if there is one thing I would want people to go away from my piece, I would say is embracing technology, technological innovations in agriculture. I mean, yeah, in Africa, that is quite true that we do not have these technological innovations at our disposal, but over here in Europe, in US, in other developed countries, they have access to these technological innovations. So one key thing that I was suggesting in my article was for us to better embrace technological innovations, to be open to data-driven solutions, because this is what we really need to solve the food-related challenges that we are facing in agriculture. We see that even in Africa, we have issues of flooding, of droughts. These are issues that technological innovations can solve. And that was the center of my article, that we should embrace technological innovations. We should be open to data-driven solutions, because this is the best way for us to solve the challenges that we are facing in Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's what you and Bukola was also echoing in our piece. But again, moving away from that, before we circle around again, just to give people a general snapshot of what's going on in the magazine, we're going to have this eventually when it comes out. So we do have several, as I said, a variety of contributions. I mean, from, say, of course, as we mentioned earlier, to, short poetic critical essays, and to pieces on sexual rights in Uganda, to police brutality in Burundi or Rwanda and in Nigeria as well, and of course to interviews from Anan. And we also have this very masterful piece from Lenora Ebule from Cameroon on entrepreneurs on the continent, which goes to what David was saying. And of course, myself, I wrote something on African spirituality or indigenous beliefs and spiritism. And of course, we do have, we have debates as well. There are debates among very interesting people regarding, for example, should Africa be a country? Jibril Yanakele was there, and Ifunanya Igweze, of course, the piece from Chiamaka, and the subsequent piece on agroecology by Bukola Dimula. Then there were also poems on human rights from Nigeria and from our fellows in Kenya. Then there is this related piece to Cool, but it's more so on democracy from Tinashe Sithole from Zimbabwe, and who is also a grad student at University of Johannesburg, a former fellow at African Liberty. Then I also have a piece on mineral control or mineral resources in the DR Congo, which is very kind of historic in its thematic focus. Then there is this piece by the Chief of Staff of Student for Liberty, Olumayo Kediro, on open trade. There is, more, poetic expressions from Zambia, Nigeria, on human dignity. Then there is this very, very, very awesome piece from the CEO of Free Market Foundation, David Ansara, on property rights in South Africa, which also go a little bit into the history of apartheid and property ownership under apartheid a little bit. And there is this very beautiful artistic work or artwork from a very awesome artist from Nigeria, Nendiso Ogenyi. And, there is a piece on religious freedom and dressing in Nigeria by Claire Mom, a former fellow here and a journalist with the cable in Nigeria. Then, of course, the Cool Conundrum piece by Feyisade Adeyemi. Then more and more poems from Zimbabwe, from Burundi. Then IDP question in Nigeria and their dignity by Dr. Nicholas Aderinto. Then, of course, the interview from David Ndenyi, which is 2-page here. And of course, more work from Burundi, and a piece on the old problem of corruption by the director of Center for Risk Analysis in South Africa, Chris Ating. Then there's another debate on if democracy has failed in Africa. That seems to be a recurring theme in this piece, the theme of democracy. So yeah, we have debates from Professor Chu and Michael Chukwuka. And this is for many of us who follow African Liberty, we recently ran an essay competition. Well, I think the chief prize or the first winner got, I think, $500. And this is the winning piece by Iwebima Emmanuel. I think it's from University of Nigeria or something like that. But yeah, this is the piece from the winner of the essay competition, Iwebima Emmanuel. And of course, so this is pretty much giving us a sneak peek into the magazine itself. And once it is out on the March the 8th, you can get the e-copy, but there'll be print copies in Nigeria and in Kenya. And I think also somewhere in Southern Africa. But primarily there'll be copies for Kenya. But I think once we get to April, there'll be print copies available in Nigeria as well. So we can send it to folks in that country. But now, to quick fire questions. So David, I was going to ask you about this response you have here. But before I go to that, I'm going to combine it actually with the question from Ernest Ironsa Magayane. I don't know where Ernest is from, but they have a question for you, David. They are saying, are you sure that your definition of freedom is applied in Africa? Instead, when our African leaders all expect their own lives and the lives of the people by the aids, or live their own life and the life of their people through aid from imperial Western powers, who are the root cause of war and conflict in Africa? I guess what they are probably trying to ask is perhaps what you see as the problem in African leaders living on, ruling through foreign aid. If you have anything to say to that. Okay, he said it's from Rwanda. But again, I also want to join that with my own question for you regarding persecution and harassment of journalists in Africa. I mean, you've seen a lot yourself. So what has been your experience, if you're comfortable sharing that? And if you already know, several of our people at African Liberty are also journalists as well, combining with public policy and whatnot. So maybe you also want to offer some advice on that end, but that'll be 2 minutes, 2-minute limits, please. Go ahead, David.
So I guess it's the same answer to both questions, including the question you asked previously about your surprise that I would choose to focus on economic freedom in my answer as against the answers you would expect a journalist to focus on. It all boils down to the fact that the current leadership across most of Africa, whether people want to hear it or not, or whether people believe it or not, or whether it's something people can process or not, that leadership actually needs Africans to be poor, because poor people are the most easily suppressed and the most easily ruled over and the most easily dominated people. If your ambition is to remain in power indefinite and to rule over terrified people who cannot challenge you, one of the best ways to do that is to ensure that they are poor. Because one of the things poverty does is that it makes it impossible for people to even think that freedom, actual freedom, is possible. So going to your second question, why it is that I chose this path and the things I have seen along this path, what primarily the reason why I've been able to do the work that I do in the way that I've done it, 90% of the reason is because of the background that I come from. It's as simple as that. If I had come from a significantly less privileged background, I would have hit a ceiling. Maybe sometime in 2020 that I would not have been able to rise beyond. Because, for example, when the government is after you, that's a very expensive proposition, right? Having to move countries, you can't just get up and do that. That requires capital, that requires connections, that requires skills, that requires knowledge. Poor people do not have these things. Right? If there is suppressed information that you think is in the public interest that people need to know, for you to even have that presence of mind that, okay, this is how to get hold of this information, this is how to pass through FOIA legal frameworks across the world, this is how to go to courts, so and so person, and then this is how to publish and bypass the traditional gatekeepers in the African media spaces. Or a poor person cannot think in that direction. A poor person is focused on survival on a day-to-day basis. So by implication, poor people cannot be free. In the world of today, it's just not possible, except you want to go live in the forest somewhere. Poor people living in a modern society cannot be free. So it all kind of boils down to the same thing, which is why over the years, I've started more and more focusing on the economic side of things, because I've come to understand that all those other things I used to focus a lot of energy on, those are symptoms. The main problem is that African leadership, whether this is a an idea that they came up with themselves, or whether this is something that is part of a new colonial project from overseas, that's up for debate. I'm not here to get involved in that debate because, you can argue it both ways. But whether it's a local idea or it's an imported idea, the fact is African leadership intentionally keeps Africans poor using the levers of states to do that, because it is only economically repressed people who can be repressed in all other spheres indefinitely.
Yeah, that's actually spot on. No lie, if you look at the, should I say, Economic Freedom Index and Human Freedom Index published by
There's correlation.
Yeah, that's correlation. The more poor you are as a country, the higher the tendency of having an autocratic regime, except for maybe countries like China, who are very autocratic, but also have some very interesting economic progress. But generally, the most impoverished countries are also oftentimes the most religious, but also the most autocratic in many cases. So thanks for that, David. So your final word, Feyisade, if you want to say anything about, maybe not only cool, but outside that, 1 minute, go ahead, Faye.
Okay, I don't know how much of my earlier, contributions were lost. What?
We got actually 90% of it.
Right. Okay, so let me just conclude by saying that the Africans should be very cautious about military interventions, even before it gets to, unseating democratic governments. This whole idea of military people conducting elections and being used to carry out civil arrests and things like that should be discouraged. And even when we then have actual military coups, as we currently have across Africa right now, the population should be very insistent on quick transition back to democracy, because in our experience, it's very clear that military regimes impoverish Africa even more than democratic ones.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing to add to that is that lately people seem to be very joyous whenever I'm to take over in an African country. There is one African country in West Africa, I don't want to mention it, that I know if the military take over today, because of what those people have seen in the last 1 month, trust me, they'll be jubilating on the streets. But again, we cannot advocate for military. All right, Chiamaka, your own conclusion in 1 minute as well. Then go to David.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to conclude by saying that I believe Africa can do better in terms of addressing the food security challenges. And I also believe that youths can lead the change, because we have access, like I previously said, we have access to digital tools and we have access to more information than the older generation. So I'm looking forward to seeing the change that would come in Africa. I hope it would come, and I hope to be part of that change. Thank you.
Yes, you're already part of that change, and it's interesting to learn of many of the innovations you and several other people, students more so, are employing in helping our elder people in the insides of the continent in agriculture, progression or mechanization, or in fact, we say now digitalization. So thanks for that, Chiamaka. And finally, David, your final word before we move forward.
Well, I guess my final words would be just to re-echo everything that I've said because of this webinar, which is that even though every kind of freedom is important, the central freedom, which for whatever reason seems to have escaped the attention of the people who advocate for freedom traditionally, maybe because it's not a very glamorous or emotive type of freedom to talk about, is actually economic freedom. That is the most fundamental freedom, which most of Africa still lacks to date. Once that particular freedom becomes a thing on the continent, then the other things will naturally, necessarily follow.
Awesome, perfect. Good way to put it. So To say, I mean, of course, thank you for each of you who joined us as guests and also participant. Question from Eric Modu. Eric, we're not gonna be able to take that question. Maybe Chiamaka, you can read that question and answer Eric privately later. And if each of you are comfortable giving out your Twitter handle, if you have DMs for people to reach out to you if they have questions, or if you don't have Twitter, maybe your email if you're comfortable with that. But as I mentioned earlier, the magazine itself will be available for $0, 0 naira, 0 shilling, Russia. Not for free, but for $0. We don't usually like to say for free, but 0 amount online at africanliberty.org/TFA from the 8th of March. And there'll be physical copies for those that come into LibertyCon in Kenya. And there'll be physical copies subsequently in Nigeria, I think in Zambia. They'll be distributed across university campuses and also. And on that note, I want to say thank you to each of you, Dr. Adeyemi. I have to be used to that now, Dr. Adeyemi. And yeah, because it's not easy to finish a PhD, as you know, we won't know that one. So yeah, Dr. Adeyemi, Chiamaka Adinnu, and friend David Undeyi, thank you, each of you, for joining us and volunteering your time, and also for contributing. And of course, to every other contributor in the magazine, thank you. And to each of you who tuned in to listen to us, thank you. The recording of this webinar will be available in about 3 days from now on our YouTube page. And of course, if you are subscribed to the African Liberty newsletter, not only will you get a copy of the magazine, but you also get a link to the call for application for our writing fellowship for younger Africans on the continent when the time comes in the first week of March. And of course, get notified of opportunities like essay competitions that we run and other engagement opportunities. So on that note, I say thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your weekend and continue to fight for freedom. Thank you.
All right.